This video is going to discuss the difference between the experimental and non-experimental research strategies. Now, your text goes into a lot of detail differentiating research strategies from research designs, and that will unfold as we progress through the semester. But here I wanted to introduce you to some important vocabulary and language and the basics, even though I know we jumped ahead in the text, because I think it's important as you start going through your literature review and all these different things to really have a good understanding of what experimental research is and what is non-experimental, and differentiating those two, keeping in mind that you will be employing the experimental research strategy. So here are some research questions that I just want you to listen to. And as I read each one, take what you've previously learned in other classes about experiments or the experimental research strategy and non-experimental research strategy, and think about which type of strategy you think would be best to answer these questions. And then we'll come back and you'll discuss each of these in a little bit more detail in an activity. So, does musical intervention improve social communication and brain connectivity in children with autism? How do early life stressors affect our ability to respond to stressors later in life? Is ketamine an effective treatment for depression? So these are all research questions, and which strategy would be best used to answer these questions? So if you're sitting there thinking, I don't really remember what the difference is, that's what we're going to go over right now. So the non-experimental research strategy is basically where the researcher is going to observe and record differences between the participants, and their goal is describing behavior. So it's just, and there's different types of non-experimental research strategies that we'll discuss later on. But again, the goal here is to describe the behavior. They're descriptive in nature, and they're observing or recording some sort of differences in participants or in a single individual. The experimental research strategy, on the other hand, is where the researcher is actually going to manipulate a variable, and they do that to determine its effect on another variable. And they're going to use random assignment of the subjects to each of these conditions. So this manipulation and this random assignment allows the researchers to determine cause and effect relationships. So the variable that the researcher is manipulating will be that independent variable. The variable they predict it will have an effect on is going to be that dependent variable. This random assignment, we'll learn more about how we do this, and it's very important. So that control allows the experimental research strategy to determine cause and effects relationships. And so that's very different than our non-experimental research strategy that just allows us to describe behavior. We're going to come back and talk later on in a later video about some of the basics of the non-experimental research strategy and kind of dive into these just on the surface of what some of these different research strategies are. And then at the end of the semester, there's a couple of full chapters that talk about them. But I think it's important for you to understand the difference to kind of at least be introduced to them now. And so before we go on and you watch the video about the experimental research strategy, I just want to give you some examples of this so you have that to compare the experimental research strategy examples to. So take a look at this picture and see if you recognize this little girl from another class maybe that you've taken in psychology. Her name is Jeannie. So Jeannie was found in 1970 after spending the first 13 years of her life in severe social isolation. She was locked in her room. She was tied to a potty chair. And basically, anytime her father she would make any noises, her father would beat her. So she didn't have any communication. And so when they found her at the age of 13, she did not have any language. And so her story and attempts to teach her language helped us learn a lot about language and the areas of brain that are more forgiving and plastic for learning language. So she was able to understand, but she was never able to properly communicate. So she could say words, but she couldn't put them together grammatically. So it really taught us a lot. And she's an example of a case study. So it's very descriptive in nature. If you kind of hear what I was saying, it describes her case. Another example is a finding that just came out last year, looking at the relationship between levels of the pesticide DDT and severity of autistic symptoms. They compared the blood of mothers that had children with autism and those that did not have children with autism. And so they had a variable So they were, the variables, one mother had, one group of mothers had children with autism, the other group did not, and they looked at the levels of this pesticide, DDT, in their blood. However, they weren't manipulating anything. So there wasn't any manipulation. There wasn't any way to randomize those. Those were already pre-existing conditions. So it's non-experimental in nature. So hopefully you see there's two elements that we have in this non-experimental research. We can measure something and we can compare. So we're describing it, right? But we can't determine cause and effect.